All right, so now that we are in the database, so all you know is that you want to write a paper about Stephen King's The 10 O'Clock People. You don't have an argument yet. What's the first thing that you would do? Okay, so you can start developing an idea based on what you've read, on your own interpretation of it. But yeah, just to start the search, I would go with Tariq. Just enter the 10 o'clock people into the database. Right. So a lot of time, uh, most of you have some idea of your argument already, because that was part of the topic proposal. But it's possible that some of you might not have had any idea and you already did some research to develop your argument. There's nothing wrong with developing your argument through a basic level of research. Obviously, when you start getting into the serious heavy-duty research, as you are with the annotated bibliography, you want to have a more clear idea of the argument that you're going to be making. But there's nothing wrong with kind of poking around a little bit to get an idea of the kind of argument you want to make. So let's try it. Let's see what comes up if we put in the 10 o'clock people. So you might put it in quotes since it's the title. If you put it in quotes, it'll keep the phrasing exact. If you leave off the quotes, then you might get something like 10 o'clock and one part of an article and people in another part, and it might be less effective. So doing something, if you're searching a title like that, especially a longer title, then you might want to put it in quotes. You could even put Stephen King, maybe just King. Let's put King. All right, so the first thing that you see at the top of each source that comes up, each listing, you'll see that you have article, book chapter, article, review. All right, so that's the first thing you want to look at. And we probably won't get any one of these here, but in response to Joshua's question from earlier about knowing a reliable source, sometimes you might see something that says dissertation. You generally want to avoid things like that. It's academic, but if it says dissertation, that usually means that it was written by a graduate student, somebody working probably on their PhD, but it hasn't necessarily been peer reviewed yet. It's in a university's holdings or whatever, but it might be useful to look at and get an idea of another side of another argument or another interpretation, and it might lead you down some pathways of research in terms of if you look at the works cited, the works referenced in that dissertation, but you generally want to avoid something that says dissertation on it. And I'm pointing that one out because I don't think it's going to come up in this Stephen King search. But avoid dissertation. What else? See where it says review and Publishers Weekly. If it says review, that's more often than not, it might be useful just to glance at. So let's have a look. So this is a book review of the Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is the full book of short stories, one of which the 10 o'clock people is. So this comes up, it's in the academic database, but it's a review from Publishers Weekly, meaning Look, you can see it's very short. It's not in depth. Publishers Weekly, if you're familiar with that, is kind of this more popular source. And you can see right off the bat, this is a wonderful cornucopia of 23 Stephen King moments. La da 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 da. So something like that signifies, if you see those grandiosely evaluative statements, there's nothing wrong with that. But for the purposes of writing an academic argument, you want to avoid those sorts of things. If this was a movie, right, it would be the equivalent of something you'd see on Rotten Tomatoes, where it's brief, it's just giving a brief judgment for popular consumption about whether a work is good or not. Most times academic articles won't be so simple as just deeming something as you should go watch it, or you should go read this book or whatever. They're usually much more complex. So yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So yeah, stick to the articles. Stick to the articles and the books. Generally avoid reviews. They might be helpful to look at because they can often direct you to other sources. So a lot of times you'll see reviews of secondary sources, and that can be useful, and they're always going to be much shorter than the article they're reviewing, if it's a review of an academic article. So it's a good way to get an idea of what that academic article is about. But it's not good to have on an annotated bibliography. It's probably not good to have the final paper. Bear with me for a second. I thought that was. Sometimes you'll if you notice that a lot of reviews are coming up for a particular scholarly article or a particular book, that might be something you want to take especially close look at, because if everyone is talking about that book or that article, then that's kind of at the center of the conversation. So that would be a seminal source that you'd want to look at. But the review itself, other than as a guidepost, you generally want to avoid reviews in terms of putting it down as an actual resource. So yeah, reviews, dissertations, don't necessarily ignore them, but don't include them in the final analysis, the final paper, or the annotated bib. But you can use them as kind of volley on to direct your research and find the really meaty articles. All right, so where does that leave us? So you can see here, so the first thing that comes up is from the Hollywood Reporter. You can see it's less than a page, it's on page 24, right? And you can get a sense of what it's talking about. Jay Baruchel will star in and exec produce an adaptation of Stephen King's The 10 O'Clock People. Just from that, does this seem like it would be a useful source? It says article, but does that seem like it would be a useful academic source? Yeah, not really. Why not? Yeah, it's more of a. I don't think it's probably any analysis, right? It's about. It sounds like a market entertainment industry. Yeah, it's like an entertainment industry news blip. Yeah, it's kind of like similar to Rotten Tomatoes. It's not. I don't think it's even a review though. It's just a news blip saying that. Let's see. All right, so when you open it up, you see that this is it. It's not even an article. It's it's like a tweet or something. I'm not saying it's a tweet, but it's the equivalent. It's just a quick line from the Hollywood Reporter, completely not useful at all, right? It's interesting to know if you liked this. If you like this story, it's interesting to know that it's supposed to be a film coming out, but it's not useful in your research. All right, so we can write. So just because it says article, that doesn't mean it's useful either. Look at where it's coming from, and look at the little caption where it shows the mention of the story. So we didn't have to open that. We could basically have written that off right off the bat. And you can see from the page count, it's not even an article. So we can write that off. What about this? Does that look like it might be useful? Yes. Okay. Eddie says no. Why yes and why no? Okay. So yeah, so it's let's say it's a maybe, right? It could just be an excerpt. We're not really sure yet. It could just be a brief mention. But if it's more than a brief mention, if it is talked about extensively in this book, it could be useful. So it's worth clicking on anyway. So for the purposes of the example, I had clicked on this, but ordinarily you'd want to just write that off. Article, The Hollywood Reporter, one page. It's not useful at all. You go to the next one. This is a book chapter that says epilogue to 10 o'clock people. So seeing this suggests that the title of the epilogue is the 10 o'clock people. And seeing something like that, if you see a book chapter that has the title that references your primary source in the title itself, then there's a good chance that it will be talking extensively about that. That's in this case, this story. So let's see. So in normal times, I would make you get at least one. In normal times, I would make you include at least one hard copy. I'd make you go to the library and research at least one hard copy book. Obviously, I'm not going to do that now. So you're kind of restricted to ebooks, unless you take that initiative on your own and go to the library. But I'm not even sure you can get into the BC library right now. All right, so what do we have? We have the whole book, The Smoke of the Gods, The Social History of Tobacco. So you want to go down to the chapter where it's referenced. And we saw that it's the epilogue. So right away, we know that it's the end. Epilogue is going to always be at the end. So you can go right there and just click on it. Let's see. So we know it's talking about the Stephen King story. Okay, so that's a check. So you want to just kind of skim it at first. You don't want to go and read it because you don't have time. You will want to go back to it, but when you're just finding the sources, you want to quickly ascertain if it might be useful. So you want to just kind of skim it. So what do we have? A typical scene among the characters. So as we're getting a bit of summary. It's talking about the monsters. By the way, just on a side note, who are the 10 o'clock people? Because almost everyone missed this question on the quiz. Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, it's the smokers, the people that see the Batman. So the monsters are just called the Bat people, whereas the 10 o'clock people are just regular human beings. They're just normal people, except for the fact that they were really heavy smokers that reduced. They can't quite give up, so they've reduced their intake to just a few cigarettes a day. And our main guy, Pearson, he sees these people come out of the offices at 10 o'clock every morning. So he gives these smokers the name the 10 o'clock people. They're kind of on the fence between smoking and not smoking, this kind of in between space. And then the monsters are the Bat people. I would imagine a lot of you, on the second question, you realized the difference on the quiz. But anyway, so we have, it's talking about the monsters. This is kind of summary. You can get through this. It seems like a lively written book, like it might be an interesting book in general. All right, so this is explaining who the 10 o'clock people are. And we see how this is a book about the tobacco. So that's, it's talking about, it's focusing on the smoking aspect of the story, that theme. All right, so this is more kind of summary. So this book as a whole isn't assuming that everyone's read the 10 o'clock people. It's giving enough summary. This is a question of knowing your audience, right? You want to give just enough summary. You want to give the proper amount of summary for your audience. If you're writing a book, or in your case, let's say you're writing about the goblin market or something, you don't want to spend the first page of your paper summarizing the goblin market, because you can assume that anyone reading it, i.e. me or anyone else in this class, has already read the goblin market. So you don't need to summarize the whole thing. You just want to point to the parts that are relevant to the argument you're making. All right, but he's giving a full summary because this book isn't solely about Stephen King in this story. So he's not assuming that everyone's read it. And we have summary all the way down here. So we have summary, summary, summary. All right, so this is explaining about the smoker. It's still kind of in the realm of summary, but we're starting to move out of summary now into more interpretive thoughts. All right, and I think here is where we get something of substance, possibly. So we see how in this epilogue, Mr. Burns here is he's finding some kind of cultural significance in Stephen King's story, The 10 O'Clock People. And we see that here. There are moments when he paints a sweetly sympathetic portrait of the American smoker at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st, providing an emotional context, however superficial, that gives the mayhem some resonance. Does that seem like it might start, at this point, does that seem like it could be something that's helpful, or you'd want to throw it away? As in, As in, would you want to go back and read it in its entirety at this point, or does it seem like it would be completely unhelpful? Yeah, I agree. I think it seems like it could be helpful. So what I would do at this point is carry on with my research, but I would make a note of this to come back to and read more fully later. So as I said, the video about researching with books, the video commentary from the weekly folder last week, again, go back and watch that. You should keep a research diary. So I would write down that title of the article of the book and the author, and make a note like might be helpful or something like that. Go back and read, and then if it's something that's not helpful at all, then you might still note it down. You might still jot down the title and write, completely useless. But this seems like it could be helpful, and depending on the kind of argument you're making, even though the bulk of this book isn't talking about this story seems to only come up in the epilogue. If you're writing about the cultural commentary that this story provides, and if the cultural commentary has something to do with the consumerism of tobacco and American consumerism more broadly or something like that, then you might want to go into this book, to other parts of this book that talk about tobacco use in America and smoking in America, and somehow tie that in. Right, so yeah, definitely a definite maybe, and worth jotting down. What about this? So we see it's an article, a window to the world, the Puritans and the Hebrew Republic. Does this seem like it might be helpful? No clue. Yeah. I would say, yeah, it doesn't feel like it, but I would still open it, because the reason I would still open it is because even though it doesn't seem like it would be immediately helpful, it is academic, and it seems like it's going beyond just a review, but it also seems like it's just mentioning it. So you might look at it. So you get this description here, right? You don't even have to open the article. In his view, and the database, the search engine thankfully highlights it. So we can see that this is talking about it's comparing to kind of religious sectors of society. It brings to mind a 1993 short story by Stephen King. So we have the title of the book here. Yeah, I would say for now, I would probably put this off to the side. I wouldn't go much deeper into it at the moment, but possibly come back and look at it later, depending on the shape that the argument starts to take. But it doesn't seem like it's helpful at the very beginning. And then we get a review of the book again, so we can write that off. What about this? Dystopian's Dilemma, Invention at the Expense of Storytelling. Yeah, it seems like a maybe. Yeah, I think it's worth opening anyway. It's worth clicking on the blue. So they don't all have those descriptions, depending on the platform. Right? It seems like depending on what your argument is. So at this stage, if we're saying that we don't have an argument yet, I think it would be worth looking at. to see if there's any real if it deals with the story with any real substance. So let's see, American War. So we see that this article is about the story in its entirety. So it's using the because the lens of to look at the culture, to look at American culture. But then it seems to drift away from King's story in particular. Yeah, so something like it's from, you can see it's from the Times Literary Supplement, so it's basically from a newspaper article, and the title is called American War. It's about a book by another author, so it's really not about the 10 o'clock people in its entirety. It's just referencing it. So yeah, that's I would not go to that right off the bat. I'd put that aside. It doesn't seem like it's really useful. So the farther you go down, you see that this is talking about Elvis, right? You can see from the title, because I put King into the search engine, so that's not useful. This isn't useful. They kind of start to dwindle out. So what do we have? We have one that seems like it's probably solidly useful, and a couple of maybes at best. So where does that leave us? Now, some of you are going to face this same dilemma. Some of you are writing about the Sphinx, for example. I know for a fact that you're only going to find maybe two articles written about the Sphinx, Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Sphinx. So you probably want to definitely, in the case of the Sphinx, you'd want to definitely take note of those two academic articles, simply because they seem to comprise the entirety of scholarship around Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe's The Sphinx. And similarly, in this case, you'd want to take note of the one or two articles that actually do talk about this story. But if there's not a lot of articles directly written about the text, the story, or the poem, or what have you that you're working on, what's the next step? Because that's not enough, right? One okay book and a couple of maybes at best. Where does that leave us? What would be the next step? So what we're doing, we're searching through OneSearch, and it's pretty comprehensive. So changing the text probably you shouldn't jump ship on your on the text that you're working on. Okay, you might start to develop an argument, but even then, where does that get you? Okay, so what sort of key terms would you shift to? So let's say that we're pretty sure that we've done an extensive search, as you can be with OneSearch, that you've searched most current scholarship about this story, and you found that there's not very much. You can rest safely on that. You might continue searching in some other way later using the title of the story, but that's kind of a dead end at this point. So what sort of thing would you want to search for? This is what on a lot of your topic proposals, I wrote down. You might have to come in through the side door, and this is what that means. Yeah. So you might try things like, this is where I would start personally. You could also do the name of the author and see what kind of. These are two different routes you could go. One isn't better than the other. But what I would do is probably start with the theme. And then go to the author. I say that now, but you could easily switch these up. It doesn't matter, but one of those two places would be the next route. So rather than searching for the title of the story or scholarship about that story in particular, you'd want to start searching for themes. So I would put something like smoking in literature. I wouldn't use quotes. I'm just looking for these key terms. Smoking, literature. You might even take out the N and see what comes up. To see what kind of representational value scholars might deem cigarettes to have in certain works of literature or something like that. So what do we have? We have an article. This seems like a medical article. Probably not useful. I'm speeding up a little bit because we have about a minute left, and I want to show you this. And I've already looked at this. So you're going through. You're going down. It's medical literature. So it's actually literature about smoking. It's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for the presence of cigarettes in literature. So we have this book here, which seems to be all about that. And if you open it up, you can get a description, an examination of the literary, philosophical, and cultural history of smoking and the forbidden pleasures of dark beauty and exacting benefits associated with cigarette use throughout the ages. You can use any of the databases. I think what we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. But you should go ahead and get started. So you see that when you go into the library database. So this book I think would be helpful, even though it doesn't talk about the 10 o'clock people. Just to note that down. You can search the themes and find parallels of how these scholarship about the symbol of smoking in literature. So you're looking for those themes, right? So we're looking at through one search. Yeah, so we're looking through one search, right? But when you go into the library database, you can see that you can go into databases and find, and for example, if you click on L, then you can find, a database that's specifically geared toward literature. The librarians will tell you to start there. I think it's more useful just to start in one search. But you want to make sure that you're using an academic database. So Google Scholar is okay, but you don't want to use just regular Google. Make sure that they're